Welcome, everyone. I'll call the meeting to order. We respectfully acknowledge that the County of Haliburton is located on Treaty 20 Mississauga territory and in the traditional territory of the Mississauga and Chippewa Nations, collectively known as the Williams Treaties First Nations. We acknowledge a shared presence of Indigenous nations throughout the area and recognize its original inhabitants as the stewards of its lands and waters since time immemorial. Could I have a mover and a seconder to adopt the agenda for the special meeting? Councillors Fury and Burton.
Moved by Councillor Fury, seconded by Councillor Burton. Be it resolved that the agenda for the October 25th, 2023 special meeting of Haliburton County Council be hereby approved.
All in favor? That's carried. Is there any notice of pecuniary interest or a general nature thereof today? Seeing none, we will move right into our items of business. So today we welcome Cheryl Faber, Kristen Maxwell, Michelle Corley, and Don Quibell, all from the City of Kawartha Lakes Human Services Division and Building and Property, to give us an update on housing and homelessness. So I will turn it over to you and welcome.
Perfect. Well, good afternoon, Madam Warden and members of council. Thank you for the opportunity for us to come and speak to you today. My name is Michelle Corley, as mentioned, and I'm the manager of housing and homelessness with the City of Kawartha Lakes. And although I'm a City of Kawartha Lakes staff member officially through a legislative arrangement, my team is part of the service manager role overseeing housing and homelessness programs for both the City of Kawartha Lakes as well as the County of Haliburton. I do have team members who live and work and serve the County of Haliburton residents. And with me today, I am going to be co-presenting with Don Quibell, who is the manager of building and property with KLH Housing Corporation. KLH Housing Corporation is our legislated local housing corporation and is also the largest landlord within the entire service manager region. Also from KLH Housing Corporation is Kirsten Maxwell, who's the CEO of the Housing Corporation. Next slide, please. Well, I'll also mention too that Cheryl Faber, the Director of Human Services, is with us today, and Cheryl will be likely chiming in during questions and answers following the presentation. So today we're looking forward to bringing you up to speed on various aspects of the 10-year housing homelessness plan, but really more so honing in on the affordable housing targets. We'll do a brief review on the local needs that are currently facing us, as well as an overview and touching base on the affordable housing targets that were established during the beginning of this 10-year plan. We'll talk about the current challenges specifically relating to affordable housing development, and we'll discuss various other items that are needed to be looked at to help us move forward with additional affordable housing development. And we'll finish off with some next steps, but also more importantly, a conversation where we can collectively look at our opportunities to move forward. Next slide. So as I mentioned, through legislation, the City of Kawartha Lakes is the designated consolidated service manager for the geographical region that includes both the County of Haliburton and the City of Kawartha Lakes. Through the Housing Services Act and other provincial funding program directives, Kawartha Lakes is required to plan and oversee the delivery of housing and homelessness programs, resources, and services. These programs and services touch most areas of the housing continuum, including everything from unsheltered homelessness, emergency shelter, community housing, and affordable home ownership. To offer some further clarification, community housing is generally referred to as the more historical, affordable rental stock that has been a long-standing public asset, often listed within legislation, and is expected to remain as affordable housing for very long periods of time or indefinitely. Although there may be some market rent apartments within these communities, primarily most of the communities offer rent gear to income rent levels. And given the low incomes of these households residing in these units, these projects typically require ongoing operating and rent subsidies to make the projects viable. Locally, we strive to have any newer affordable housing that's come on to play also meet rent geared to income rent levels. And we include both the newer affordable housing units as well as the community housing units within our single application for community and affordable housing. I'll also point out that the housing continuum image on this slide is purposely circular, as people's housing journeys are not always following a simple linear path.
Yeah.
For instance, the senior who's been a long time tenant in a private rental unit may have just found themselves facing a rent eviction and, maybe has not explored the rental market for quite some time. And given this news and reality, they might be now, unfortunately, having to maybe face homelessness for the first time. Next slide, please. Also included within the Housing Services Act is the requirement for service managers to implement a 10-year housing and homelessness plan. The current 10-year plan was established in 2020, but most of the work leading up to it occurred in 2019. There was extensive community consultations with residents in the county, as well as staff and other agency partners in the County of Haliburton and the City of Kawartha Lakes. The Housing and Homelessness Plan is an extensive plan that has over 60 individual objectives and covering over 8 different provincially directed policy areas. And for the first time, this plan now includes affordable housing targets, whereas our previous plan did not include specific targets. This slide also reviews the progression of the plan with council, specifically also the City of Kawartha Lakes, as well as separately the County of Haliburton Council, supporting both the plan and the current housing targets in 2019. And then in 2024, we will be conducting a midpoint review of the current plan. So there'll be an update to the plan next year, additional consultations and things such as that will take place. We're also waiting on provincial direction as to what the province wants us to have in plans going forward. Next slide, please.
No. They're on their way with the toy.
As previously mentioned, a large element of the current 10-year housing and homelessness plan was the establishment of affordable housing targets. And these targets were separately identified and adopted by council in 2019, just prior to council endorsing the actual entire 10-year housing and homelessness plan. In order to meet local needs for affordable housing, 750 new affordable housing opportunities are needed by 2029, specifically in the County of Haliburton. During 2019, when we brought forward to the county the various options around the affordable housing targets, there was 3 different models provided, with the County of Haliburton specifically adopting the more aggressive set of affordable housing targets. The approach taken with the targets was that we needed several partners to help us achieve them. Council supported the goal that KLH Housing Corporation would build 150 new affordable rental units in the county, with nonprofit partners and private developers each contributing 50 new units, and that we would need to access approximately 500 existing or new market rent units to make them affordable through rent subsidies. Targets were also established for household categories, such as low-income households and middle-income households, in support of housing units as well, which would be made up specifically of low-income households requiring supports. The targets were calculated based on an assessment of over 24 different data points, and looking at a variety of different local data elements, including needs indicators such as waiting list data, demographics, employment trends, and other things such as that. Next slide, please. So just doing a quick review on some data points specific to current local needs. In the last 3 years, we have been adding households to the community housing waiting list at a rate of 12 to 13 times greater than we're actually housing people from that same list. This increase in wait times, this is increasing wait times, and now folks are sometimes waiting up to 14 years for an opportunity of community housing. And it's causing residents to be in very precarious housing situations while they wait for this opportunity. I know in Kawartha Lakes, and sometimes I'm hearing here as well, this is forcing households to reside in living situations that are sometimes outside of other municipal bylaws, requirements, and situations. I also will point out on this slide and information that I brought forward to the Joint Advisory Committee last year was that 90% of households who have been housed into community housing units specifically located in the county of Haliburton, 90% were filled from residents of the service manager region. I think 85% were from the county directly, with 5% coming from Kawartha Lakes. So we're predominantly housing those who are local. Next slide. So it's not uncommon that there's confusion around the term affordable housing. The definition that we follow states affordable housing is rental housing with a rental rate not exceeding 30% of the gross annual household income of low and moderate income households. There's all sorts of different impacts that this definition can have on a variety of programs. Sometimes we are driven by affordable housing definitions connected to funding programs. And we know with all the news that's out there right now and work that the provincial government's doing through impacts related to Bill 23 and Bill 134, that at a provincial level, the province is looking to reestablish the definition of affordable housing. I'm happy to hear that that definition is likely to include a connection to income, which is very important, as opposed to just tying average rents or affordable housing to market-driven rent rates. Next slide, please. Given the increasing pressure on the dwindling private rental market supply and increasing need, supply and demand have created conditions allowing rents to far outpace increases in household incomes, creating in some cases a 72% rent increase over the last 5 years. So for those of you who aren't aware, the city of Kawartha Lakes, since 2017, collects extensive information on private rental rates on a weekly basis. And we've been maintaining our own database on this. We have been closely then monitoring average market rent rates for communities, and we were able to separate out specific towns and villages across the whole service manager area. We're also able to keep track of the number of advertised rental units. So we can look at changes for just simply the number of units that have been advertised privately for rent from prior years to what we're facing currently. So those are some pretty stark increases in rents that we have seen, and it's something that us in our municipal capacity as service manager are completely powerless over. And it is important to kind of put this into context with the impacts of that this is happening, especially on low income households where incomes have been pretty static. For instance, households in receipt of social assistance are provided $390 for a single person to cover rent costs. And that has remained the same since 2018. So when we see stats like this, it is concerning to see that rents have rose so much, but yet we know incomes are certainly not doing the same. Next slide, please. Given the need, a very intentional effort is needed to meet our affordable housing targets. We need to prioritize our efforts to achieve the affordable housing targets, and we can't take the risk to see affordable housing come by chance through expected growth. So we need to be purposeful when we are talking about affordable housing units. And we need to be purposeful in making sure that we have some control and ability to monitor those units and maintain those rent levels. Because as I've illustrated in previous slides, when we don't have any jurisdiction over rental units, then we're completely powerless when outside market changes can affect them. And sometimes, as we've seen, decrease them and take them out of the market rent market. So I will demonstrate on a slide our progress, in the county of Haliburton, similarly to the Kawartha Lakes. We are not making as much progress as we would like to with achieving the affordable housing targets. So many things have impacted this, and we'll talk on some of that in a little bit later on some further slides. But generally in Haliburton, we have so far achieved 15 new affordable rental units since the beginning of the 10-year plan in 2020. And there's a potential of another 35 that may come onto the affordable housing market stock, but that's still to be determined, and I'll touch on that a little bit later. So really, we are looking at aiming for at least another 700 units to meet our targets by 2029. Next slide, please. So approximately $400,000 is now the new reality of cash that's needed to build one new affordable housing unit. This has risen significantly over the last few years, given increases in construction costs, and is consistent in what local affordable housing developers are experiencing. And this estimate is also in line with what the EOWC presented to the County of Haliburton Council back in the spring, I believe, in their 7 and 7 presentation. In order to meet our targets, 735 units still require financial support. So although I mentioned 700 on the previous slide, those other 35 units that are in pre-development stages right now are not able to move forward due to financial limitations. So if we're aiming at 735 new units to be fully funded, those are some of the raw financial numbers facing us in order to meet the affordable housing targets. So $294 million. I'll discuss a little bit later about some anticipated funding opportunities that might help us make some progress towards this. Next slide, please. Further to the scope of our role as service manager, it's also important, and I certainly recognize it with what I see every day in my work, is that unmet need in affordable housing development shows up in other areas of our responsibility and work and community overall. So we know that unmet need can directly impact municipal budgets when we're looking to then maybe shift our gears to more of a response phase and have to start funding more emergency shelters, which are extremely costly and obviously don't provide any housing benefit. Emergency shelters are simply a way to warehouse individuals, and unless there's affordable housing for people to flow into, it's really getting more and more challenging to see people only stay in emergency shelter for a short period of time. So we need to be aware that if we are not making those upstream investments in affordable housing, we are going to see directly some of those impacts still at our municipal work and responsibility. Next slide. And Kirsten, I'll let you.
Great, thank you. In spite of the challenges building affordable housing, there has been some progress made in the last 10 years. In terms of support of projects, the county and municipalities have been waiving fees and charges, which is a significant contribution to new projects. Land donations have been an important component of successful projects, including from the private sector. And the County of Haliburton has contributed or committed cash contributions as well, upfront capital, which is always extremely helpful. That has enabled KLH in particular to increase our stock in the county by 125%, or 69 new units in the past 10 years. And that's compared to the increase in the city of Kawartha Lakes of 22%, or 73 units. It has, however, also led to some expectations that are providing additional challenge now that there have been changes in the outside world and financially in particular. One is the misconception that upper level of government funding is always available and is sufficient to build housing. That completing a project every 2 years is possible, and that debenture or mortgaging a loan is enough to make a project viable. With increased interest costs and increased construction costs overall, that's no longer the case. Also, that revenues will be sufficient to cover financing and operating costs, or that rent subsidy costs are sustainable. Those are all challenges that we'll get into further.
So there's been a number of factors that have significantly impacted our progress towards meeting the affordable housing targets. Significant changes in the housing market have created limited home ownership opportunities for first-time buyers, only adding additional pressure on the existing stressed rental market. Locally and globally, we have seen uptake in financialization of housing. Housing financialization is when housing is used as an opportunity for wealth and investment, much like a commodity is treated, rather than an important element within a thriving community. Locally, we see this in various forms, including when investment property owners have opportunities to make additional financial gains, such as through short-term rentals, rent evictions, or simply the sale of rental properties when markets are favorable to do so. The results of these activities have had significant impacts on our private rental market locally. We are all seeing the effects of rising inflation in our lives, but this is also a reality causing landlords to further increase the rents, creating additional affordability challenges for households. Finally, the needs of our population are also changing, and for many reasons requiring an increased need for additional supports within affordable housing units. I'll also add to that, every time interest rates rise, that is creating significant impacts towards future affordable housing developments.
Okay.
Next slide, please.
No, you can put them on mute.
So in terms of the biggest challenge by far for developing affordable housing is on the financial side. Construction costs have increased quite significantly. Interest rate increases really have had a devastating impact on our budgets and pro formas. And in the face of that, household incomes have remained static, directly affecting the revenues and operating budgets. Adding to that, in spite of what you may hear in the news, federal and provincial funding is reduced and is unpredictable, and often requires a significant amount of municipal and other cost matching to leverage the funds from the provincial and federal government. We can borrow funds to pay for construction, but at the moment it is only working because the city borrows on KLH's behalf. So there aren't issues with the amount of debt coverage ratio that we're able to have, or as a requirement if we were to borrow from CMHC or from private lenders. But we still can't pay financing costs. They're far higher than even full market rents would be. Additionally, I just want to caution you to be sort of wary of some of what you might hear in the news on federal and provincial funding and programs. The announcements tend to oversell the programs, and when you actually sort of lay out the financial impact on a project, it's disappointing to say the least. In spite of the recent news, the primary change that we've seen is removal of the HST, GST from rental projects. That doesn't have much of an impact on us as a community housing provider because we only pay a small portion of that regardless. And I just also want to highlight it's CMHC programs. The scoring criteria don't favor rural and smaller municipalities. primary goal of CMHC is to create the most units for the least amount of money. And also to meet other federal priorities, often which are population-based. And the amount of municipal cost share that they're looking for is quite significant. One of the most significant components of the project score is the portion of the capital development costs that are already funded by municipality or others. And they're also looking for high density built form, which is more typical of a large urban center than county. So I will pass it on to Don, who will give you an overview, more detailed look at a historical and current project pro forma to give you a better sense of the changes that have occurred over the last years in development finance.
North Lakes Haliburton Housing has one current affordable housing project within the county right now. This is a private public partnership with Mr. Bill Switzer, located on Highway 35 on the river. When we normally start our projects, we're looking at the projects about 5 years in advance of actually occupying the building. So we're building our budgets and our pro formas 5 years in advance. What we can see with the spreadsheet is the change in the construction costs and our financing, which is our difficulty to proceed with this project. 5 years ago, we estimated our projects at around $200 a square foot. And today we are anywhere between $350 and $450 a square foot, which has increased for that project alone from a $9.2 million project to a almost $17 million project. The contributions that we've received from the county, from Mr. Switzer, from the city, those numbers don't change on any of our projects from that 5-year span. What we end up with is twice the expense to build that property, from a $6.7 million project to a $14.4 million project. The annual operating expenses don't normally change. Those are our daily utility expenses and operating expenses. The financing charges for that project is from 5 years ago was 2% interest, and now we're at a 5% interest. The total operating costs, the financing costs are $1.2 million today compared to $361,000 5 years ago. The per unit annual expense, $40,785 today, which would leave the per unit monthly expense of $3,395. We saw in our previous slides what we can charge those tenants. That leaves the rent subsidy that would be requested from the county, $57,750, and for the yearly rent subsidy would be $693 for that one property. 5 years ago, we would have been asking for $156,000 in subsidies for that project. This project right now financially is on hold. We also have 2 properties in Lindsay that are in the exact same situation that we cannot proceed with the project. Next slide.
All right, this slide is to demonstrate just how important upfront capital is to creating a project. We've covered it generally, talking about financing costs. This is to emphasize that point and also point out the relatively small portion of a project budget for land and overall municipal fees. Those are both really important, but overall they make up a relatively small amount of the finances required to build. When we have the upfront capital costs covered, we're able to make projects affordable naturally for the life of the build. And we're just through the rents, revenues received, able to cover operating costs. But when we're required to cover financing costs through the operating budget, the projects simply aren't viable, or as Don said, huge amounts of operating subsidy are required. And with each time interest rates increase, the situation just becomes worse. Even when we can borrow, under CMHC limits the amount of that they will finance a project to 75% of a project. So still significant amount of upfront capital is required. And we just can't make the numbers work in terms of managing the operating budget. Next slide, please. Just further demonstration of the same idea. If we cover all of the costs in upfront capital, that's what we pay for the project. At current interest rates, if we were to finance all of that, we're looking at total cost of $53 million, 686,000, 11.1 million of that being interest alone. So very significant benefit to upfront capital. Next slide, please. In addition to funding, I love how I always get to be the naysayer or bring all the negative, depressing news. Availability of service land is also a challenge. And, I know with the availability of land itself in the county not being an issue, the challenge is with the availability of water and septic services. And if we are to provide those services on a per project basis or through a private servicing, there are significant additional upfront capital costs, as well as quite significant operating costs. KLH currently operates 3 wells, and there's a cost to those of just the operating of about $50,000 a year, which for a single small building is very significant. And labor, the availability of labor for construction sort of across the province is an ongoing challenge as well. Next slide, please. So there has been discussion about the creation of or the support of reserve funds for affordable housing development. And I just want to point out that even though it would take some time to accumulate enough to do a project, the size of the Gull River project with total cost of 17 million, there's still quite significant benefit in reserve funds to create opportunities for development. Overall, they can support project viability. Reserve funds can also incentivize other private sector or nonprofit partners to build affordable housing. And quite importantly to us, they can enable the creation of a pipeline of shovel-ready projects that are ready and waiting for surprise announcements of future federal and provincial funds. As Don said, it takes about 3 years to get a project from conception to the point of being ready for a building permit, and several $100,000. And with the current federal and provincial programs, you can really only apply once or you're very close to being shovel ready. So we need some upfront funds to do all of that pre-development work, all of the studies, secure the land and so on to get a project ready for that point. And I've already mentioned the importance of municipal cost sharing funds to leverage federal and provincial funding. There is a requirement and a high expectation that there will be municipal funds available before the federal and provincial governments are willing to come forward with funds themselves.
Next slide, please. So as already mentioned, planning for anticipated federal and provincial funding allocations is really challenging. And we can do our best estimate on what we might anticipate over the next 2 years, consistent to what we have seen over the last few years. So on this slide, I've tried to do exactly that, kind of looking at by the end of 2029 that we might receive in around $2.4 million, give or take. But again, this is totally an estimate just on past funding allocations. We do not get long-standing notices of allocations of funding. I've also included in this chart, but didn't project it out to 2029, was the current balance that the County of Haliburton has already invested in an affordable housing reserve fund. And that balance, I understand, will be in place as of the end of 2023. And I will give the county credit to be looking at establishing a reserve fund for affordable housing. I know this was initiated several years ago already. This is not something at the City of Kawartha Lakes that we're currently doing. So I applaud that the county has taken this proactive measure. I've also included just a couple of other potential funding sources that we might see come our way, but again, we don't know. You're just as familiar as I am around the Eastern Ontario Wardens Caucus 7 and 7 initiative. That's a great collective advocacy approach that group is taking. So we will continue to follow that work and see what they're able to get for us. And then there's other sometimes standalone federal funding initiatives that come. Like Kirsten alluded to, they can come out of nowhere, and we have to be ready and have a project sufficiently at a stage that would even be allow us to be eligible to apply. I also have included, but I don't know exactly where the county's at currently with this topic, is around accessing or directing funds from municipal accommodation tax. And sometimes I know other municipalities are looking at this for their short-term rentals. There is the option through the Municipal Act to direct some of that tax revenue towards things like affordable housing. So it might be an option to look at as well. Next slide, please.
Sorry. From an operational perspective, we tend to look at projects of about 50 units and find that about 50 units per hectare is sort of an ideal density for affordable housing. So this slide is just to indicate sort of how much land, service land would be required to meet the targets in the plan, being 700 total. We'll be looking at 14 hectares. I know previously we've had presentations and discussed options for servicing both water and septic, and would certainly encourage further discussion or exploration on that.
Next slide, please. Almost done. So, in addition to just the money, I shouldn't say just the money, because I certainly hope that we've been able to get across that the financial reality is our biggest barrier right now. But while we wait and hopefully try to remain optimistic that things will change in that regards, there's other things we can be doing at a municipal level that we do have control over to help get in place so when the time's right, we can move as quickly as possible in developing affordable housing. So we've already talked about the importance to invest into a capital reserve fund specifically for affordable housing. We also want to make sure that building staff are educated and have knowledge on any new building systems that may be as an advantage and help build affordable housing. There's more and more work happening around modular units. We want to make sure we can also achieve appropriate density with any modular projects, but it will be important for municipal inspectors and whatnot to be familiar ahead of time with some of these new things coming. It's also important too, as mentioned, I won't go over it, but just the servicing opportunities. But I know the county is really exploring some things that are happening. I think it was last month at a special council meeting, Frontenac County staff were here and discussing some of the innovative work they're doing around communal servicing. So continue to explore things like that. And that's really going to be beneficial. Additionally, staff can also explore ways to help support operating costs, as we've tried to illustrate through some of the prior slides. There's the capital side of it, but there's also the operating side of it. A significant amount of the subsidy going towards KLH Housing Corporation now is actually used to pay property taxes. So one thing that is available to us through the Municipal Act is to exempt affordable housing development from property taxes. That may be something to look at to help us gain any sort of space on the operating budgets of these projects. If we can reduce some of those operating costs, then there's less pressure on having higher rents, which is then all connected to rent subsidies as well. And then also always encourage municipalities wherever possible to explore other streamlining opportunities through planning processes to help prioritize through those processes any affordable housing builds. As Dawn talked and mentioned, when we're doing at least a 2 to 3 year development phase, pre-development phase on a project, time is money. And so if we can prioritize through our municipal processes, anything related to do with affordable housing, it doesn't come as a cost to a municipality, but it certainly can benefit affordable housing projects. So it's something we can collectively explore down the road. And also, encouraging things like mixed use development. So if you're looking to build any new municipal buildings, is there opportunities to also add a few residential units on that same site? Things like that. We really need to kind of look under every rock and explore every opportunity for affordable housing development. Next slide, please. So additional opportunities for municipal support. Municipalities can also indirectly support affordable housing through implementing disincentives to discourage vacant units, as well as underdeveloped or idle land. I don't know if this is a pressing matter facing the county, but it is something that some are doing. So I just wanted to include it here just for knowledge's sake. Also, given the rising social challenges, the municipality as well as other community partners can also continue to support the implementation of the community safety and well-being plans. And you guys are far ahead down that path with having a dedicated resource at municipal staff level to help make sure that that community safety and well-being plan doesn't just sit on the shelf. And there's lots of great collaboration happening in the county through that work. And then finally, advocacy to upper levels of government, just to ensure that there is appropriate concerns being brought forward to upper levels of government of some of the realities that our residents are facing as far as housing affordability, and not simply building 1.5 million homes over the next 2 years is not going to address some of these gaps that we're facing with affordable housing. I also do have a point in here around just encouraging and incentivizing private developers. We've been trying to do this through the Affordable Housing Target Program. But I'm hoping over the next year, we can look at redoing that program. But in order to have sufficient incentives to make it worthwhile, and that is the biggest feedback we do hear from developers with that program, is that the incentives aren't deep enough to make the numbers work. We might have to explore any further budget opportunities to support that program. But that being said, those are just a sampling of just some things that are within our toolbox and control at a municipal level. So next slide. So really in closing, we're happy to take any questions that you may have, and we encourage really an opportunity for just simple discussion really on this really big, important topic. Collaboratively, we want to support each other in this work and in specifically meeting the affordable housing needs of our residents. And just, we want to make sure that the information we brought forward today was helpful. And we want to know what we can continue to do to support the county. And just open the floor to any questions or comments at this time. Thank you.
I was waiting for the good news. Questions from members of council? And good, I was going to say, could we bring other members of council back in? Questions or comments, Councillor Carter?
So, I think we've talked about this a little bit before. The numbers on that Don showed us here in dealing with a couple of other housing corporations and so on, their numbers are equal, in some cases even higher, into the over $500 per square foot. And it's not changing. It seems to continue to accelerate. And as you see, even we can go out and borrow that money. The capital funding is available to us, but then you have to pay it back. These people are really picky about that. And that means our operating costs are such that we cannot generate enough funds to pay it back. The other part of it is that from the moment of inception to the time the project is let to the time it's built, you're borrowing money all the way along and having to pay that back, and you don't get any revenue. Like, you don't collect the first rent until a month after people get into the building. So it's really difficult at this point. And without some help, I mean, there are some things, for instance, that where Infrastructure Ontario will only allow you 30-year maturities, and so that would be helpful to at least spread out the costs. CMHC will give you up to 50 years, but then they won't do 100% of the project. So you've got to figure out how to handle that part of it. So there are some things there, but even with those issues dealt with, there's no way of making these affordable. I mean, we certainly can't throw in the subsidy that would be required to make the project affordable. We can't, our tax base can't support that. So unless we find some magic way of getting some capital, through either a provincial or federal pixie dust program, it's going to be really difficult for us to do anything over the next little while. And if we can't do anything for the next 3 years, like, how are you going to get to those goals that you've set? And it seems to fall on deaf ears, not here locally, but certainly when you talk at the higher, more senior levels of government. I mean, there's study after study that will show that taking people out of homelessness actually saves you money, because there's less demand on health care services and police services and so on and so forth. So there's, it makes sense, but it's hard to get anybody to to buy into that. So unless capital is the key here.
Councillor Dayu.
Well, this is a nightmare. It is a bone-chilling nightmare. And I applaud you for not just digging straight into that vocabulary in your presentation, because it's really, really frightening. And certainly not just, we all know, it's not just us, it's the entire province and well beyond that. But to see how those figures materialize in our communities is really frightening.
And they're only going to get worse.
And they're only getting worse, and they're clearly set on a trajectory for getting worse. I can only think that a complete overhaul of our economic system is going to be what, and obviously that's far to the control of anyone sitting here or anywhere for that matter. The one very practical question I have has to do with the shovel-ready projects. Great idea that we've got a few things that have 2 or 3 years of planning under their belt, so that if pop-up funding arises, we can jump on them. What is your experience on how often shovel-ready projects in fact match up to eligibility requirements? I mean, say there's a pop-up funding, but it's for only units which are 3 layers or 3 floors or more, but we're all at 3, we're all at 2 floors or whatever it might be, or name a criteria. It's almost infinite, the number of ways that one could design a housing unit. So how confident are you that we could do something that we could quickly adapt to whatever the criteria coming through are? And then the second part of that question is, what is your experience on having partner developers there who are willing to put in that time and effort to get a project on paper and then sit back and wait for something to arise? Does that happen? Do people know that that's just how life is these days?
I can address that. I guess we can be grateful to CMHC for one thing, and that being their consistency. They're pretty clear in terms of most of the criteria. I wish less so on the cost sharing one in particular. They are looking for a higher density, particularly with transit involved, which is a big part of the disadvantage of smaller communities. They're focused on certain priority populations, and always looking for supports. So we can certainly tailor our projects towards those criteria. Again, the big challenge being the cost share. In terms of partners willing to sort of come on board and sit and wait, we've been very fortunate with Bill Switzer and his knowledge of the development industry and now of affordable housing as well. He has been very patient and very great partner in terms of collaboration and continual communication and so on. In fact, he joined KLH's board a year or so ago. So I'm less optimistic about the opportunities for other private sector developer partners. My previous position, I spent a lot of time trying to get a project going with the private sector, and that wasn't, it in the end was not very successful. So that's perhaps not the ideal partnership. Almost every private sector developer needs some level of profit, even if it's just to keep the banks and the lenders happy. But certainly, other agencies and so on or just, managing the project ourselves. It is generally our preference.
Go ahead.
If I can, through you, to the counselor, just to build on that too, is from the developer side too, is there an opportunity as we presented there from the municipality side to look at new development? And what proportion of new development would we want to hold that developer accountable for in order to build affordable housing? So like a certain percentage. That is something that we've been looking at, that we have at the City of Kawartha Lakes, and at the recent Eastern Ontario Wardens Caucus meeting that we had, it came up in the discussion of the providers there as another opportunity. So we as the municipalities take that ownership to define some type of a policy around that. And if it not be a certain proportion built based on the affordable housing definition that the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing is getting to with Bill 134, then could they provide a cash in lieu to then build into your reserve? So that's another opportunity that we as municipalities can set the parameters. Is it going to give you significant numbers? It all depends on the size of the development. So it's another opportunity. And as Kirsten has mentioned, certain developers are very, certainly as Bill, he's been very congenial through the whole process. However, I'm not sure all developers would want to sit back and wait for their project and their investment to come to fruition. So a few extra thoughts.
I would think there might come a time when an investor would decide to cut their losses and withdraw from the project. Don.
If I could expand on Kirsten's explanation, our design of our individual projects does not influence whether or not we receive CMHC funding or not. The specific design doesn't normally influence it. And between Kawartha Lakes Haliburton Housing and Mr. Bill Switzer for Highway 35, between the two of us, we've invested about $1.3 million under that project so far. We do not have a building permit, but we would classify ourselves as being shovel ready. $1.3 million on that property alone. That includes Mr. Switzer's contribution of his land.
Councillor Carter.
Yeah, I think so. One of the difficult areas right now is your building costs. So in my work with Habitat for Humanity, we have the ability to do something a little bit different because we're a charity. And so therefore, you might get, in some cases, just using a fictitious example, where Habitat for Humanity Canada might sign an agreement with Owens Corning. And so then all the insulation that we would use in any build comes in at a discounted rate. Make deals with local contractors, with the Home Depots, with all sorts of people, and all of that, every dollar or two you knock off that per square foot, changes the amount of capital that's required and so on. And that's, it's really unfortunate that we here, we're not a charity. So, we can't avail ourselves of these types of things. But, this is the situation that we're in. That build cost is, and we can work it. And one of the things on the Switzer project was he was, thought to be hopefully get it so it's something that's reproducible, that, might be able to be built in some modular fashion and so on. But even with all that, our costs are so damn high right now. It's frightening, and I'm not going to go to the nightmare, but it's pretty, it is a bit dystopian.
One of the questions that I had when you talked about the market values that had been struck for 1 and 2 bedroom units and the increases that have taken place, I wonder if you can maybe provide some information on why there would be such a huge difference in increases between the 1 and 2 bedroom units?
So a few things that would come into play there, and we don't necessarily have all the answers on this too. This is private data that we're just simply tracking with what's being advertised. I will say that there's a larger demand for 1 bedroom units across both the city of Kawartha Lakes and especially the county. So even on our community housing waiting list, like I would say probably off the top of my head, at least 70% of the applicants are looking for those 1 bedroom units. If you look at, it's all connected to income. So income for a single individual, as I mentioned, is ridiculously low. Families, they have different opportunities for incomes. Canada Child benefits have increased significant. There's different income opportunities for that household. But for single folks, that 1 bedroom is most desirable. So I would say largely this is driven by supply and demand. And I would say actually the 3 bedroom, I know you didn't mention the 3 bedroom, but we've seen a significant decrease on the available number of 3 bedroom units just simply advertised as rental units. And we suspect actually largely that's due to entire homes that have now been switched to short-term rentals, or, that investment property owner took the opportunity when house prices increased to sell that investment property and to take advantage of the investment, which was their purpose for having it. And again, so those things have happened that we suspect that have been outside of our control. So I'm not sure if that fully answers your question.
Oh, it does. I was really interested in hearing you say the impact that short-term rentals do have on the availability of housing, because there's been of course, because we're in the process, there's been a lot of arguments made to, pro and con for short-term rental control. And a lot of people, especially those in the business, are saying, well, there's no way. I mean, if there's fewer short-term rentals, that there'll be more rental or houses available. And the more confirmation that I can hear of that, the better. I think that possibly Councillor Ryall had a question. Oh, I'm sorry. It was Councillor Burton.
I think it was Councillor Burton had a question.
Thank you, Warden. It was probably going back to the opportunities or funding opportunities, where I just take for a second. And I just wondered if the group have ever reached out to the Ontario Aboriginal Housing Service. I just wondered there may be an opportunity there.
Through the warden to the councillor. So yes, we have had a conversation with them. It was probably 18 months ago. They are interested, but only solely interested in land opportunities that are fully serviced. That was the direction and desire that they expressed with me. So I haven't talked to them more recently than that, but that was the conversation that we had at the time. I do know they also have to go through some of the same channels that we would need to apply for some funding opportunities. But we do know, of course, nationally, there has been priorities given to Indigenous peoples. So, and they are a very experienced developer too. So we would have that reassurance of that affordable housing opportunity given their reputation. So I'll continue to work with them whenever those opportunities are present. Thank you.
It's interesting that they're focused completely on service land, because there's been some change in thinking about communal services and the development of communal services and how that can reduce development costs. And you'd almost think that there might be a little more interest in that. Councillor Carter and then Councillor Rao.
And sort of another side point, the numbers that we have, and I applaud this group because they decided that the standard CMHC numbers were not good enough, so they've gone out and weekly surveyed to try to get the pulse of exactly what's happening in both CCAL and in the county. But the thing is so those numbers are decent. Okay, I mean, they may not be perfect, but they're decent. But the thing is to recognize is back to the folks that are out there that are being supported through various government programs, including Ontario Works, where you can see the difference between what $390 a month and what the actual is. It puts people, certainly people that my wife deal with, that they have to decide whether they're paying the rent, getting their drugs, eating, or putting fuel in the car. I mean, or fuel for heat. And, part of the fact that, governments like to say, well, we're not increasing our spending, but the other expenses continue to go up, and $390 a month is, you'd be difficult to get the tent. So I think that costs us. That costs us as a community. It certainly costs those people, but it costs us because somehow they need to be supported.
Councillor Rail.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this is going to have any relevance whatsoever, but for those of us who might be slightly a little older, I can remember when interest rates on houses were over 20%. And we were still building houses. So the question became, how did we do it? Like, what did we do then to enable us to build that we could rob and duplicate scale slightly today? Because at 5% and 6%, and even if it goes to 7%, it's nowhere near the plus 20% that we were running back in that day. So there's got to be something that was done in history, and it has to be documented somewhere, that what was done in order to get around that issue. And can it be replicated, modernized, and applied to today's situation?
Go ahead.
Okay. I certainly don't have all of the answer, but that's a really great question and a great way to look at it. I would suggest that a significant component of it, at least for rental and community housing, is federal and provincial investment at the time. Most of the multi-residential rental housing that's present now was built before the 90s with significant federal tax credits if it were private sector, and significant upfront capital investment by the federal government as well as the provincial government. Both of those withdrew entirely from supporting new development, again, be it community affordable housing or private market rental housing, effective in the 90s. When the federal government came back with the national housing strategy, there was a lot of excitement that we might see that kind of investment again, but instead CMHC chose quite a different approach, and being primarily a lender with very, very little upfront capital available.
Other questions from council? From my perspective, the one thing that I wanted a little bit of clarity on, you mentioned alternate design standards. I just wondered if you could clarify that a little bit and how that would have an impact on, like, I'm thinking about the building code and, how those two meet.
Sure. Yeah, I can start. Kirsten may want to add a couple more things. So, sorry, I should have talked more about that point specifically, but alternative design standards could be things like, we know there's less parking requirements for an affordable housing build versus others, but through existing policies and things like that, there's kind of strictly written in there that there's, 2 parking spots needed for each unit. So then, because of that standard that's typically set for all development across the board, affordable housing developers have to go through requests for a change in that through municipal processes. So that takes additional time to go through those processes to request an alternative. So there's some examples like that and others that we could work together on and design a standard that's in place for affordable housing builds. So as of right, if it's an affordable housing build, some of those design standards are naturally modified for affordable housing without needing to take the route of doing changes.
I would add, looking forward, designing new projects, we'd be looking at considerably smaller units. Some of the other affordable, successful projects I've seen, the units can be quite small, although well-designed and with, a fair bit of common space to facilitate sort of more living space, and increased density from some of what we've been building so far.
Thank you. Councillor Diane.
The one reassuring thing that I'm getting from all of this is that in Algonquin Highlands, we are going through a conversation right now on what can we do with our series of bylaws, our zoning bylaw, with the tiny amounts of land that we have available to us, municipal land, and everything that we've talked about so far pretty much lines up consistently with what you've described as some of the opportunities in-house. So that's, I'm looking at you, of course, because we're both from Algonquin Highlands. So I find that to be quite reassuring. And in Algonquin Highlands, we're undergoing a strategic plan right now. And so this is quite good timing, in fact, that we can bring this reassurance into that conversation as well as into our ongoing housing conversation on the side of that. Would you agree, Warden?
Yes, I would. My head's going Algonquin Islands and what we can do and how we can do this. Go ahead, Cheryl.
I was just going to add to that through you to the counselor, or just even on this topic is, and it was raised in the presentation, is around land. It's almost like a housing first strategy within the municipality. So if land does come up, like municipal owned land that you have that you are maybe wanting to dispose of or sell, is it looking at that first just to see is it feasible for housing, as well as asset disposition? Like if we are in the means of, getting rid of some type of an asset that could, from a density perspective or an operating model perspective, make sense or be built upon or renovated, is that something we could also look at from a municipal policy or bylaw perspective? So you just take that stance in your municipality that housing first is your strategy before you look through any other lens. How could we make that work or possible? And I think that's the same on your development side is, like what could you put in place to enable developers to contribute? And, the capital discussion, the reserve conversation, I think that still behooves us to kind of think, what could that look like even in cash strapped times. Now, I did hear today that the CPI was not going up, but I don't know if that was rumor or an actual fact. Is this recorded? But anyway, that I think the capital piece, what you heard from us loud and clear, and certainly Councillor Carter indicated that without that capital piece too, we can't move forward. But from a readiness, can we do some policy and bylaw work locally to help enable that?
Councillor Carter.
Since Minden has the largest, serviced area, one of the things that we've started to look at is we're looking at all underutilized buildings and land, certainly within the serviced area, to try to figure out, what is out there, and then eventually figure out what we can do about it. And if we can, if there is legislation, if there is ways of encouraging that land to move from a derelict building into housing, well, then I think that's a good thing.
Any other questions from members of council? Oh, I'm sorry, Kirsten.
If I could just add sort of my overall theme and the way I think of it, not to get too depressed, is just that now's the time to get ready. Get ready for when the change comes. It has to change at some point, both in term for KLH in terms of strengthening the organization, but in terms of development, being ready with projects and updated bylaws and all of the great things that we've talked about.
I wish I could feel that, that positive change coming. I did have one more question. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Councillor Fury. You have a question?
Yeah, well, I have a question, maybe
Or
more
a comment?
or a comment. I mean, times like this require different thinking than we've always done in the past. Like somebody alerted to, I think it was cease that, what happened when 22% interest rate. Well, first of all, there was a lot less people in Canada, and there was a lot less poverty in Canada then too. So but my thinking here is, when I was on that board, and maybe it's changed, but every time there was a project, we went out and hired an engineer and a new architect. And I don't know why these units all can't be more cookie cutter or more reasonable. Or do we need to go through that? That's an expensive process, if I remember. And I think that we have to start. I was watching a show the other night where they were doing with modular homes, like almost prefabbed. They were putting them up in no time. And I wouldn't want to take that work away from our local economy either, but we're in a panic situation here. To think that the interest rates are going to go down and the price of lumber and everything is going to go down to where it was 2 years ago is not going to happen unless the world goes down, because that's the way it is. So you're still not going to have the money 3 years. Like I think someone there said, well, we might be 3 years building. We might be 5. How far are we behind then? We're bringing in 50,000 new people a month. Some of them are going to end up here in these units. So where do we put them? Like this is pretty well panic time, I think. Anyway.
One last question that I had. You mentioned the ability to reduce taxes or waive taxes, and I guess, maybe I'm mistaken, but it seems to me that there's some pretty in-place restrictions on where we can offer or waive taxes or reduce taxes, and I'm wondering if you've got any insight about that.
Yeah, so through the Municipal Act, there are certainly certain situations where you can exempt property taxes. Affordable housing is one of them, but it can only be done through a municipal housing facilities agreement and bylaw. So we already do that municipal housing facilities agreement and bylaw for our existing builds that have happened over the last 10 years. That arrangement is in there because there has been incentives and gifts offered from the municipality to the housing corporation. So to follow what's in place, and part of our requirements, Municipal Act, is we do need to have that agreement and bylaw in place. With that, then comes the natural mechanisms to ensure that we're monitoring ongoing affordability and whatnot. But since we already have that mechanism in place to secure other incentives provided, it would be one simple additional line to include the value of the property taxes as an exemption in there. If for some reason something happened and that developer was not living true to the promises that they made, that agreement gives us the ability to revoke that at any time. Property tax exemptions can also take place in different forms. It doesn't have to be entirely. It can be just for the portion of units that are truly affordable, and it can be for a shorter period of time. It could be just for the first 10 years. When you get a chance to go into the whole economic review of affordable housing, but the first 10 years typically are the most challenging in an operating pro forma. So even if property taxes were just waived for a smaller period of time, it is a tool available to us, and other municipalities are doing this already.
Thank you. Thank you for that clarification. Any other questions, Councillor Rao?
Yeah, first up, I think that's a great idea. I mean, the idea of being able to use a controlled subsidy on taxes to bring the affordability under control is a good thing, but it requires one thing: a building. You can't tax what isn't there. And so our problem is not only in how do we control the after build, it's how do you get them built in the first place. And a lot of what we talked about today, the reduction of taxes will certainly help the developers stay online for a period of time post-build. But pre-build, where do we go with that? I mean, I appreciate you can't solve all things with one item. I mean, that may be one item that solves a piece, but we still have to get them built, and we still have to find land, and we have to get capital to get them built. And I'm wondering about that.
As are we all. Any further questions or comments? Well, I'd really like to thank you for all of you for coming here today, for the information that you've given us. It's not necessarily welcome information, but we need to know where we stand and the things that we can do, how we can work together. And, you've provided some really good information to us on that. And let's just hope that we manage to have some success over the next few years, because we really have a problem. There's no doubt about it. And with that, I would ask if there's a mover and a seconder to receive the delegation. Councillor Carter, Councillor Dayou.
Moved by Councillor Carter, seconded by Councillor Dayou. Be it resolved that Haliburton County Council receives for information the delegation from City of Kawartha Lake staff providing an update on the 10-year housing and homelessness plan.
All in favor? That's carried. Thank you. Could I have a mover and a seconder for the confirming bylaw? Councillor Shell and Dayou.
Moved by Councillor Shell, seconded by Councillor Dayou. Be it resolved that bylaw 4213 being a bylaw to confirm the proceedings of the October 25th, 2023 special meeting of Haliburton County Council be considered to be read a first, second, third time, finally passed, and the seal of the corporation be affixed.
All in favor? That's carried. And finally, a motion to adjourn. Councillor Carter, Councillor Burton.
Moved by Councillor Carter, seconded by Councillor Burton. Be it resolved that the October 25th, 2023 special meeting of Haliburton County Council be adjourned.
All in favor? That's carried. Thanks again.